Daiga Ho. Welcome to my talk about red team strategies for helping protect the modern workplace. My name is Johann, and I'm going to talk you through some of my thoughts about what we can do to protect the modern workplace in this presentation. Thanks everybody for coming. Really appreciate you listening in. And so let's get started. So a little bit about myself. My name is Johann, as I said. I've been an offensive security engineer and a security engineering manager for a longer time. Most notably, I worked at Microsoft for quite a long time. I first worked in Redmond in the SQL Server division, where I was part of the security team to increase the security of Microsoft SQL Server. And then that sort of moved into the cloud with Microsoft Azure and the data platform, where I led an offensive security team for multiple years. And after that, I went to Uber to build a red team at Uber. And on the side, I kind of taught a little bit at the University of Washington here in Seattle, which I really like. I always like learning new things, and I love teaching. And right now, I do mostly just security consulting and penetration testing and so on. If you want to get a hold of me, reach out on Twitter. My alias is here, or kind of I have a blog as well where I share some of my thoughts around red teaming. So let's get started. So I want to talk a little bit about the modern workplace, how a red team can actually help kind of protect the modern workplace, how it can show up problems that might arise in the modern workplace. And then we want to talk about zero trust, assume breach, and home field advantage, which are kind of some of the strategies I think that are very useful in protecting the modern workplace and use as a red team. And then talk about MITRE and dive into that a little bit more. And then at the very end, I want to cover survivorship bias briefly. So the modern workplace, what is it? Basically, it means we work from anywhere at any time and from any device, right? Super convenient. It really enables the business. But the important part is also that we want to not lose the control over the data, right? Security really is here. Security engineering is really here to help enable the business to be more productive and to enable these scenarios that we can actually work from anywhere on any device, right? And so historically, this has always been sort of in this closed shop security or full trust environments, how I would call them. When I prepared for this slide, actually, I had to think one of my professors in school kind of always talked about closed shop systems, which were, he actually used that word back in the mainframe days, where they had like facilities where there was a mainframe and nobody was allowed inside. It was really highly restricted. And so they used the word closed shop security back then. And then in the mid 90s, when I was like taking that class, he told me that, you know, people got really nervous when client server computing started to happen, because all of a sudden the control was lost, right? The data was now much more distributed in a client server fashion rather than just being on the mainframe. But basically what then happened again is with the intranet scenarios, right? We kind of established this full trust within the company where we have like this castle, right? And you have the perimeter, and as soon as you're inside, like the location basically defines the security. As soon as you get inside that castle and it's inside the corporation, there is very little security. And that is a problem. So what probably you're all familiar with, the new strategy in this case is really zero trust, right? That we have a perimeterless network where every device and that has to authenticate correctly, it has to prove every time that it actually is authorized to access a certain data, or otherwise is rejected. What this also means is that now we have first, location by itself is not enough anymore to grant access, right? So you have to have a machine certificate, maybe multi-factor authentication. So you might have much more granular, much higher ways of authentication, much more different ways of authentication. And based on how strong you authenticate, right, you get access to certain data or not. But what this also means now is that we have our data now is basically moved out to all these devices as well, right? Because you access the data from your phone. That means the data is on your phone for that time, or maybe even you store it on the phone. And there's actually a quote from Semperium, which is a mobile threat researching company, that points out that 60% of the endpoints containing or accessing enterprise data are mobile. That is a pretty high number, right? So this data is already out there, and we really need to kind of help protect it. So how can this is sort of really happening. And when last year, I remember getting this email from the FBI saying, now actors are more likely to target Wi-Fi networks, right, for teleworking in hot hotels and so on, because a lot of people work from home now. And so guest access to Wi-Fi networks is sort of under attack. And what this really means, if you think about the remote work and the mobile devices environments, is that the adversary now actually will come to your house. So this is really new, but it will be the new norm, because you work from home. If your company gets compromised, your computer gets compromised, your home environment also gets compromised. So I guess in a way, you also need to implement zero trust within your own house. Otherwise, your company can compromise you or your home environment. And that is something that really to think about and consider as well, that the adversary will come to your house. So how can the red team now help in this whole move to this new world? Right, it's basically very similar to how it was in the past. Right? Red teams need to do a lot of research around threat actors and understanding what adversaries the business might have. Right, what would be the advantage? What would an enemy or an adversary actually want from the business? Right, what would they try to exploit? That research, right, then the red team can make predictions, can create hypotheses on which scenarios are most likely to occur and what this would mean. And then the red team can emulate it, perform an operation, execute on that, and share the results with the organization, and then basically close the loop, continue updating internal risk models, internal graphs about how does the environments look like, and so on, and then continue the research and doing another round of this attack. And so what does this mean in more detail? The research phase, right? This is really about knowing your adversary, like who or which organization might be trying to gain access to your data, whatever it is that is most valuable or that you care about the most, right? And the question is why they might want to do it as well, right? What are the reasons this actually happens? So in this, if you start thinking about this is much more long-term thinking, right? When you do penetration testing and so on, you're focused on the application, on the vulnerabilities. But if you do red teaming, you're focused on the entire system and a strategic goal an adversary might have that you need to consider when you do this analysis. And when you have that data, right, with that analysis comes basically this idea that you need to do threat-informed offense. You need to research threat intel reports. What are current adversaries doing? Let's say you're a bank. Then you think about, other banks. What adversaries are they having? What attacks are they being faced? What are they fighting off? And there's a lot of open source intelligence that can help you understand that. And this is really what I call the home field advantage. Is you can really understand your own environment the best, right? You can understand your own environment better than an adversary. So with that advantage, you can protect it better. You can also attack it better, which means you can protect it and defend it better. You can prepare for such scenarios. So a big part of this is, of course, to understand the home field, you need to do an asset inventory, which means, you also want to do data classification to understand what is the most valuable data in your organization. And this is also when risk models or risk modeling comes into the picture, right? Understanding your home field, understanding the value of the assets, and then maybe doing predictions like Monte Carlo simulations. This is really, I think, where a lot more research needs to happen, that we use things like Monte Carlo simulations in security engineering, that we can better predict uncertain events. What would happen if this happens? What is the financial impact? If you do, for instance, go to a financial advisor or do retirement planning, right? This is very common to do Monte Carlo simulations around outcomes of when you want to retire, how much money you want to have when you retire, and so on. So this, we should really apply this similar thinking to security, rather than just depending on assessments like, oh, this is a high severity vulnerability or critical vulnerability, because that often lacks a lot of context and doesn't tell you about the financial implications of a vulnerability. After that, the red team, or it's not always just the red team by itself, right? There's like people that get together to plan such an operation, including the blue team and engineers, potentially, right? Decide it should be emulated, meaning like doing the real attack on the real production systems, appearing to be an external adversary, or should we just simulate something? Simulating is more like you test it out. Or another option is tabletop exercises. Some things you might not be able to actually do or get legal approval to actually perform, but you can still think it through a tabletop exercise. And as I mentioned, legal, real quick, real brief. This is exactly with the remote work environment. Red teams also face a lot of challenges now, because you need to have safeguards in place in your tooling to make sure that you're not getting out of bounds, right? That you're not all of a sudden you compromise a laptop and then you do lateral movement to, I don't know, the Xbox of a person's house. That's not good. So that's really something that needs to be understood better, and legal implications. So really working close with your legal counsel is also important for such operations. And what can really help throughout all these stages as well, especially in the planning and also in the communication phase, is the MITRE ATT&CK framework, which I'm sure many of you actually have heard about, so I won't be talking about it too much. But the attack framework basically is this knowledge base of adversarial behavior, meaning it's a catalog where MITRE put together all the tactics and techniques that has been publicly seen in the open source intelligence world, that we know adversaries are performing these techniques and tactics, and they kind of catalog them. And it's like free for everybody to use. And I also encourage people to contribute back to it, like I contributed to it as well, because I think sharing that information is really critical for all of us to help improve systems. And it comes in various flavors for mobile, enterprise, industrial control systems. There's also some projects I saw about AI and Kubernetes. But the focus again is really on public threat intelligence, what is publicly known. And this is how the enterprise matrix looks like. I assume everybody has seen this before, so I won't be talking too much about this. Just two things that changed last year. Like there was a phase called the pre-attack, I think it was called, that moved into the attack, the main framework. So now you have reconnaissance and resource development as extra phases in this matrix. And the second thing that happened, the change that happened last year, was the introduction of sub-techniques, which allows a much more granular processing or like expression of what an adversary is actually doing. So those are like two changes that happened recently. And another thing that I think a lot of people do not know as well, or as much about, is that there's a separate matrix actually for mobile, for like phones. And those two are not yet merged together. So a lot of people focus on enterprise, which is sort of this traditional Active Directory, often Active Directory environment and so on. But mobile is a little bit to the side. So I encourage everybody to study the mobile matrix a little bit, and also think about your adversaries, how they might leverage some of these techniques to gain an advantage. And talking about mobile, there was a presentation I saw a few months ago by Cybereason, and they talked about an Android malware they identified in March 2020 called the Eventbot. And I found this super interesting. So it targets about 200 financial institutions. So, and what it does, the malware is basically it runs on your Android phone, and it leverages accessibility features to collect personal data, passwords, keystrokes, try to interfere with banking transactions you perform in these 200 financial institutions it supports. And it can also read SMS codes, and with the goal to bypass multi-factor authentication, of course. And what Cybereason did, they put all of this actually into that matrix and published this in a blog post to showing you which techniques this malware is actually using. So it's super interesting, I thought. You see credential access happens via capturing SMS messages or doing the input capture. And so it's a great way to analyze and put this information into more structure. Now we reached the third phase, which is actually doing an operation, right? And there's multiple choices and options for how to approach this, basically. The first is regular unit testing. I call this test automation, right? It might not have to be done by a red team. This could be done by a regular engineering team as well. Then we have the purple teaming, which I'm a big fan of, as well as red teaming, right, which is more adversarial. And then there's a lot of automation and tooling that can be built. And I point out a few frameworks here, like Mida has Caldera, or there's Atomic from McCanary. And doing that, you might also want to do threat hunting so that your threat hunters actually try to find the blue team, the red team, and try to actually actively hunt for them and so on. And this is really what I kind of like when I look at this, is what I call the communication fence that often is between the red team and the blue team, where there's not a lot of communication happening. So the red team operates for multiple months, sometimes even, right? Doesn't really trigger a lot of detections, and then the blue team learns about it and then can't really find them at this point. So there's often a lot of like disconnect, where it would be much more efficient to actually more closely collaborate, right? Not always, I want to highlight that too, but majority of cases you should probably collaborate much more close, where you actually have sort of a feedback loop, and the red team compromises the machine and like, hey, blue team, did you see that? You know, and sometimes you might even sit next to each other. And so I've seen this in my career being very productive and very actually helping with really quick improvements to the security posture. This is more like the comparison between a waterfall software engineering model and an agile model, so to speak. And then the fourth phase is actually, let's talk about the improvements. And this is really about implementing the mitigations, improving the security posture, refining the attack graph. Usually red teams have always in the attack graph sort of how they see the company or the organization and what attacks they know will succeed and what the likelihood of how them succeeding. So they have a pretty good model, sometimes even one of the better models in an organization on how the assets are connected with each other. And also refining the risk model, of course, which make updating risk scores and so on. One thing I wanted to highlight is about the blue team, which the blue team in general, I think, you know, is often seen as like the SOC or somebody like working in the security organization, but I would always define it a lot broader, like including all the engineers in the company, all the employees, right, that build and use these systems, right? And you might want to get their input as well. And I've found it really interesting, and this is not a term I kind of defined, but manage mind by walking around and just talking to people. You know, and I don't mean this now in a social engineering kind of way, like, but really just and transparently communicate, hey, I'm from the red team, we're planning operations, we are looking for ideas and trying to find weak spots, and then have people communicate with you and share their ideas. Or because engineers, especially engineers, I know, they often know a lot of vulnerabilities in their systems and where they might not get the resources to fix them. So that's where the red team can actually help shine a light on critical problems sometimes as well. And the last step here is the education, right? You know, giving presentations, sharing the information with the others in the company after operations conclude. So now I want to briefly walk through one of these attack graphs and what might happen. And I chose sort of the scenario we talked earlier with public Wi-Fi endpoint. So the red team goes ahead and compromises an employee who works on a public Wi-Fi. And the way this might actually happen, and you will be surprised, I've seen this happen quite often, is that laptops have SSH open. Somebody in the organization enables it, probably for remote management. And then if you're on a public Wi-Fi, right, anybody can just connect to that endpoint and try to brute force or perform password spraying to gain access. And after that, they perform lateral movement. Now, do you think about it? You're on an untrusted Wi-Fi, but if this company has a VPN, which is sort of a little bit, VPNs are sort of interesting in the zero trust world, right? Because a VPN sort of reflects more of the legacy, not always, but reflects more of the old school thinking, right? You get into the VPN and then you have access to a lot of things. And often network connectivity is one of these things that you all of a sudden have this interconnectivity between computers. So now you can, from this laptop in the coffee shop, because it's on VPN, you can access a DevOps engineer that is currently working in production, potentially, right? And this lateral move is sort of interesting to analyze for a red team, especially thinking about mobile devices, right? Red teams should spend a lot of time thinking about how can a mobile device perform lateral movement into the organization, or into other areas of the organization. And then a common step that I find interesting with virtual data centers, right, with having everything in the cloud, or a lot of data stored in the cloud, is this idea that you steal the browser cookie from that machine, you exfiltrate that, and then malware uses that browser cookie and an attack that I call pass the cookie. Basically, you just leverage the cookie, replay it, do a session hijack, and then you gain access to the Azure account, to the AWS account, or it could also be like Salesforce or any web application basically that is being targeted. And here you can see how this might look like. If you then look all these techniques we used to do this operation, we put it on the attack matrix, play attack bingo in a sense, right? And then you can see here credential access, right? We use the session cookies, we have used them then to perform lateral movement into the cloud account. We used SSH to perform lateral movement. So this gives you a really good picture of what happened during the operation. So to wrap up, this part is really, we talked about zero trust, right? Which is the right model for the modern workplace to always validate credentials and identity and location as well. So it's like this package to always trust, to never trust and always verify. And then we have assume breach, which is sort of this idea that is also around for a long time, that you always should think about things being compromised and what happens then, right? Rather than thinking you can prevent it, you always should think, what if it has already happened? What can we do then? And the last part that I kind of talked about was this home field advantage that I'm a real big fan of. So now I would like to spend the last 5 minutes or so just talking a little bit about survivorship bias. It's a more advanced topic, I think. More if you're a red team, you might find it super interesting. But what I mean with survivorship bias is this idea, it's like a term that is defined as, that only the things that are very successful is the stories you hear about. Like, the startups like Uber or something, right, that have this rapid growth, you hear about them, but you don't really hear much about all the failed startups. And similarly, there was the scenario, this is from Wikipedia. I first saw this on Reddit about, I don't know, a year ago, that in World War II, the military, tried to identify where they should increase or put better protections in place for planes, right? And they had all these bullet holes on the planes that came back, and then they had this discussions and analysis where they should improve the planes, right? And the military initially had pointed out, we should improve the spots where we had the bullet holes. And then a statistician, a professor from the University Columbia in New York, I think, proposed that we should actually go ahead and, strengthen the parts that we do not see bullet holes, right? Because those are the planes that do not come back. And that's like this thinking about, you don't want to focus just on the things that survive, but you need to have a step back and look at the big picture. And for red teaming, this also applies to some sense, right? If you think about the MITRE ATT&CK framework, as we talked earlier, it talks about open source intelligence, right? By design, only things that we know have been used. And on a side note, it doesn't really cover insider threats as well explicitly, I would say, right? You can always compensate for that because I think insider threats are pretty well understood by most red teams. The attack framework is really great, I think. And in addition, you can also leverage MITRE's KPAC model if you're a red team. And there's like another tool that you can leverage. It's common attack pattern enumeration, where there's more useful insights on what an adversary might actually do. But now bringing this back to the survivorship bias thinking, we have this matrix now created with the attack navigator. You can overlay different layers of detections, and where there were no detections. And if you think about this, right, you can create this exact analogy. And I saw this first done by Matt Snyder, I believe, who, you can think about this now. It's like you have this matrix that shows you where, the red team is sort of, which techniques the red team uses. And then in the future, you might want to spend more time, not just the places you have problems, but the red team should explore the places we do not have any knowledge about, right? Or actually maybe even missing pieces. There might be things on this matrix that are missing depending on the situation of your organization. Okay, so to wrap up, really a little bit of a call to action. I always like that in the end of a presentation. I think you should perform an assume breach exercise from a mobile device standpoint, right? Really look at that. Leverage the mobile attack matrix to get insights of what threats you might be facing. I also encourage everybody to look at blue team infrastructure, right, to help protect the blue team infrastructure, because it's a very powerful infrastructure with all the endpoint agents that basically, if a red team or an adversary compromises that infrastructure, right, they can control any host in the network in many, many ways. And then locking down machines. This is sort of this thing that I think most of the presentations I'm giving, I talk about this a lot, because this is really what enables lateral movement. If you have remote management endpoints exposed, review those right now. For instance, check your own laptop, check your own computer. Do you have SSH open? Do you have RDP open? Can somebody just connect to your computer? And if they know the password, if there's a vulnerability, can you just log in? That's something really to consider. So look at that. And also do not have too many administrators, or ideally only one administrator on the computer. And always remember, right, that the adversary now with this new model, they might actually also come to your house. That keep that in mind, to also protect your own infrastructure accordingly. Okay, with that, I want to say .GLA, and if you have any questions, you can email me, you can find me on Twitter, or check out my blog. I regularly blog about red teaming topics. Thank you very much, and yeah, have a great rest of the conference.